Alright, I'm going to record this now. This is going to be Pod16, I guess. Did Pod 15 the other day, going over a chapter in A Feast for Crows with Lady Jenna, or Gemma, whatever her name is, the aunt of Jaime Lannister and Cersei Lannister, and has a conversation with him near River Run, and etc., etc., etc. So if you're interested in that, go check out my pod, which was number 15. So this will be number 16. I didn't actually get to the 3 sort of bits of material I thought I might do pods of the other day. So I'm going to get to at least one of those parts now. So I just finished my little series, which was probably pod 12 through 14 was Plato's Euthyphro, and finishing that up. And so I guess the idea for this, slightly broadly, of this series of the podcast would be to go over material that I would consider relevant in sort of an intro to philosophy sort of way of reading Plato, and then my particular reading being essentially informed by the textbook, this anthology I have, Readings in Ancient Greek Philosophy from Thales to Aristotle, 4th edition, edited by S. Mark Cohen, Patricia Curd, and CDC Reeve. So this particular anthology, I think, has a really good set of Plato's work in it, and it's not completely extensive. I just got a book that's apparently the complete works, and it's just as thick as the anthology with much smaller type and much more fragile pages. So for the anthology side of things, I think this one does a good job of it just does a good job of organizing all of the dialogues, and I think it organizes them in an interesting sort of chronological way. So I just finished up Euthyphro, and from the end of that you can know whether or not Socrates is going in or coming out from his arraignment, indictment, whatever the description of that process is. He's around the court and has the conversation with Euthyphro, which goes around in circles and then eventually ends fairly shortly. And so Socrates is left wanting as far as a definition if for piety is concerned. And then within the anthology, the next dialogue that's listed is the apology. You look at some of these dialogues as being a bit of the sort of tragedy of Socrates, and tragedy meaning kind of the ancient Greek, particularly the Athenian sort of tradition and theater of them writing these sort of either trilogy stories, or sometimes it could be, I guess in this case this would be a much longer series, so it's not exactly a trilogy but like a series of stories. Think of the Orestia, you can think of the Iliad and the Odyssey is sort of a set, and then if you look at the Little Iliad or the other pieces that were allegedly considered to be significant texts as well during the ancient period, you can point to different things, but that's not the most important. I guess what's important here is just understanding that when you talk about, I think especially Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo, that makes up 4 dialogues sort of set right there. And I think that those dialogues, they consist of a lot of what you might consider to be the most historical of the dialogues. Now, I'll throw this idea out there though too, the idea that the Phaedo dialogue is more legend than fact would not surprise me for a number of reasons. Number one, Plato not actually being there himself being a large reason for that idea, but still not impossible that the Phaedo is really a relatively faithful depiction of the period subsequent to his subsequent to their attempts to get him out of jail in Crito, which I will do. I thought I might do Crito second, actually. That's probably why I'm getting tripped up here by starting with Apology, but it totally makes more sense to go with Apology first and Crito, because some of the other dialogues, I think, you can make good arguments that you're not meant to take them historically at all. Although I guess you can make a good argument that even something like Euthyphro, you can't necessarily assume that events such as what are related in Euthyphro actually happened. They could be purely theoretical. So I guess that's possible, and that's something to consider, because Apology in particular would seem to be a historically sourced document, and then you can go to Xenophon's version and compare and contrast, and then have your arguments about how capable Xenophon was of transmitting a guy like Socrates' ideas properly. How much do you bias towards Plato? How much do you resist Plato for his potentially impressing his ideas on people through these dialogues, etc. So as far as Euthyphro and Crito are concerned, and Phaedo as well, you could argue they're not historical. Sure, I think you could. And then I guess there'd be no real evidence in favor or against as far as, Euthyphro is concerned. There's not going to be verifiable public records of Socrates' conversation with a random mantis outside of court. You know what I'm saying? So, just because we know that somebody like a Euthyphro did exist doesn't mean that we have historical knowledge of them via the dialogue. We just have an impression that Plato is trying to create. So, let's see. Yeah, there's nothing really there. I thought this was more of like a reading list, but that note is nonsense, so I'm just going to put that away. Alright, so starting with the Apology. So, like one of the good things about Plato, especially presented in this anthology, Plato, like I said when I started with Euthyphro, very good writer, or at least he translates really effectively into English, but I'm supposing it's the skill of the original writing that's continuing to carry through, because the stories, they always start in the beginning. There's not a lot of fluff. I think one thing you can say after reading Homer's Iliad and Odyssey is that there are forms of writing where you go through the whole routine of say what you're going to say it, and say what you said. That whole silly idea that you learned in 5th grade in your writing class, writing your 5-paragraph essays or whatever it is. But there's that sort of writing, and then there's good writing, which is where you just start in the beginning and you're really actually somewhere in the middle, and you start with interesting things. So in this particular case, Plato's Apology starts, I don't know, men of Athens, how you were affected by my accusers. As for me, I was almost carried away by them. They spoke so persuasively. And yet almost nothing they said is true. So remembering what I said last time, the Socratic irony bit of things is always an important consideration, that when we're looking at things that Socrates says, does, etc., at least looking at it through the irony perspective of, how persuasive were the accusers actually, what did they say of him. It's sort of notable here that Plato really doesn't, he doesn't include the portion where Socrates is being accused, and this is where somebody like an eye of stone can point at that and say, well, Plato, you're trying to create an impression of your friend, and conveniently when you talk about his trial, you don't really even include the portion where people are speaking against them. You only include the part where the persuasive speaker speaks persuasively in their own defense. But one of the interesting things about Socrates is he uses as a tactic in his dialectic, which he will employ here, that he will, it's almost, I guess we refer to it in modern parlance as fake humble, that he will, talk about how he's not persuasive and other people are, and all these other things, and you could think of it as, false modesty, etc. And then it's sort of given away, the irony when he says something like, yet almost nothing that they said is true. And so you look at a guy like Socrates and you say, he's the kind of guy to say, what a wonderful presentation you just gave, so persuasive, da-da-da-da. It's such a shame that nothing you said is true. It's like, it's a bit of a record scratch there, my good sir. But anyway, that's just to throw those ideas out there that he's not, this thing from Plato is not a courting. We're not seeing the whole picture. And the whole picture as a whole, it's used in other things to judge ancient Athens, to say, how does a democracy with, alleged freedom, this, that, and the other, especially for their citizens, how do they put to death guys such as Socrates, where, at least from what the dialogues depict, there's nothing of what he was doing that was so malicious that anything along the lines of what happened to him was appropriate. And it's considered a kind of a black eye for ancient Athens as far as their legacy is concerned, School of Athens, all this sort of thing, that they put a citizen like this to death. And I think, though, that that's sort of the appearance versus reality thing, which is a big theme in Plato, and it will be really relevant in the politics side of it, because I think Socrates, through Plato, but I think we can say for the historical Socrates that he had a certain, I've used the word contempt, it might not be the right word, but a certain attitude towards his fellow citizens and the political system in which they exist, such that you can make arguments like an eye of stone did in his trial of Socrates, that essentially the things that got Socrates in trouble for the most part was not his innovation in religious matters. That's essentially an excuse that these idiots bringing the charges use as something they think is going to bolster their case. But the legs of the case is really the theoretically negative influence that Socrates has had on some of his pupils, who have gone on to become like Critias, some of the 30 tyrants, etc. So arguably Socrates has contributed to the intellectual development of a number of people who were staunchly anti-democratic, elitist, etc., 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 and certainly seem to have taken advantage of Socrates' ideology in order to advance their own interests. But it's not really clear that Socrates, was on board for all of that, because Socrates, as far as we know, he was a mason of some sort. I think he made statues and stuff, so he was essentially working class. That's why you look at some of his theories of Plato in particular, when you're talking about the Republic and the myth of people having the essence of the metals in their soul, and then a gold child being born to bronze parents, and you basically have to take that child away and raise them to be the philosopher, and that's kind of a nod to a Socrates type character that, of course, these sorts of people are born among what might be considered economically and socially the lower class of society, etc. So that's just to throw all that on the table, that Plato is not including, and possibly intentionally so, the parts of the speeches against Socrates that most affected the jury. But I think Plato, with his character of Socrates, will persuasively make the argument that ancient Athens, even at its height, was really more of a mirage of this sort of school of Athens thing than anything you could really point to in reality and say it's completely beyond reproach. So I think that's where it's relevant, just that Socrates seems to have been very consistent on certain points, among which is his sort of contempt for the sophists, therefore his sort of contempt for persuasive speaking and being carried away, and the idea that this is not really the way of conveying truth, and that Socrates will then pivot to his sort of dialectical method as his method for going for the truth, as opposed to focusing on persuasion. And so Socrates continues. He says, among their many falsehoods, however, one especially amazed me, that you must be careful not to be deceived by me, since I'm a dangerously clever speaker. That they aren't ashamed at being immediately refuted by the facts once it becomes apparent that I'm not a clever speaker at all. That seems to me the most shameless of them. So this is, again, the irony here. Anybody reading Plato can understand that Socrates is quite the clever speaker, and that it's not that he tries to deceive people, but he definitely thinks several steps ahead of people, and that can be easily mistaken for the other. So he says, I'm not a clever speaker at all, unless of course the one they call clever is the one that tells the truth. That's what they mean. I'd agree that I'm an orator, although not one of their sort. No, indeed, rather, just as I claimed, they have said little or nothing true, whereas from me you'll hear the whole truth. But not by Zeus, men of Athens, expressed in elegant language like theirs, arranged in fine words and phrases. Instead, what you hear will be spoken extemporaneously in whatever words come to mind. And let none of you expect me to do otherwise, for I put my trust in the justice of what I say. After all, it wouldn't be appropriate at my age, gentlemen, to come before you speaking in polished artificial language like a young man. So, I have some notes here for this paragraph. Among them, at the beginning, they spoke so persuasively. My note is dripping with sarcasm. Then you must be careful not to be deceived by me. I have cave dwellers, which I guess is a reference to the allegory of the cave. If I get to Republic in a series like this, we'll get there a long time from now. But essentially, within the allegory of the cave sort of metaphor, the enlightened person tries to return to their society and share their knowledge, and they're considered dangerous for their knowledge, because their knowledge essentially interferes with the supposed knowledge of the people who see really well with the shadows and the dark. So that's a little reference there, and then I have underlined a line, unless of course the one they call clever is the one who tells the truth. So Socrates finally lets it rip, lays into critique of the, I don't even know what I can't even read my writing, but basically what I said here is that, and this is on the Socratic irony of side of things again, is that if you read Socrates as, his voice is essentially dripping with sarcasm at all times, then him talking about, the persuasive speaking of the speakers is really, like, even more so, like, pointing out, that they're idiots, but, I'll get to them in a minute. They're so persuasive. Watch me. I don't even use these sort of rhetorical tactics, and I'm still going to defeat them. And that's sort of the virtue of Socrates' method, at least theoretically, is that. So he says here, I think there's a lot of virtue to this. What you hear will be spoken extemporaneously, and whatever words come to mind, let none of you expect me to do otherwise, for I put my trust in the justice of what I say. And I think I relate to that as far as these presentations are concerned. I'm trying to just roll through the material, point to point to point, A to B to C, 1 to 2 to 3, and trying to give sort of my analysis along the way, stopping at points that I think are relevant based on notes that I've made in the past, but still, like Socrates says, and it's kind of inspiring, extemporaneously, in whatever words come to mind, spontaneously, intuitively, letting sort of the muses speak through you in a metaphorical sense, because you put the trust in the justice of what you say, that you've done the work and you're prepared, etc. And so, when you analyze somebody like Socrates, there's just these arguments that are made. It's like, is Socrates essentially a sarcastic asshole? Is he really, like, closer to somebody with a form of autism where he has, almost a bizarrely sincere view of his accusers, where he doesn't have contempt? It's just hard to argue that he doesn't have contempt for them, because I think in his behavior, in a lot of the dialogues, you can see that even though Socrates certainly seems to have suffered from certain form of either seizure syndromes or these long bouts of thinking that could easily be mistaken for a form of epileptic behavior, but his behavior is just described by other people, and in his speaking is just too normal to really think that he was such a bizarre personality. I think that certainly he's like a personality of his own, but I think he fit in with other people. So the degree to which he had the sort of the Asperger's or the autism, whatever, where it's just a kind of a way of describing how he could get locked in and fixated on something in particular and be very hard to rouse and disturb from his state once in that state. Again, how to explain that, but I do think that the best explanation overall is that inside the whole time, especially when he's here, and I talked about this a little bit last time, but Socrates is essentially going to provoke the jury, although he's going to try to defend himself, so he's not provoking them to convict him. He tries. At least you could definitely make the argument that he thumbs his nose at the jury several times during his defense, and at the prosecution, but you can argue that he made a real attempt to defend himself before being convicted, and then upon conviction sort of analyzes the situation and says, well, they really fucked up, and the only way they could fuck this up worse is if they, put me to death for this, and I'm an old man, etc. I think there's really good arguments to be made in that case in favor of that. I'm not necessarily certain that my opinion on it would be, I don't know if Socrates really thought that they were going to put him to death when he said the things that he said. I also think he was cool with it because we can see him in Phaedo and Crito, his sort of attitude on these matters. I don't think he was afraid to stand on business. I just think he he didn't mind pulling the lion's whisker. I just don't know if he quite anticipated they were going to bite his whole head off, but that was what it was. So I've kind of spoiled the ending of this, and we're not through the first page, but also make a little note again, talking about his religion in the last dialogue, talking about Euthyphro. Note here, he's speaking to the jurors, and he still invokes, by Zeus, men of Athens. So no matter what his opinions eventually come to, he will still reside largely within a framework that is defined by the religious sort of conventions of his society. So so that was the first paragraph, so I may only get through the first page here, but we shall see. 1 second. Get a drink of water for the second paragraph. Alright. Indeed, men of Athens, this I positively entreat of you. If you hear me making my defense using the same sort of language that I'm accustomed to use both in the marketplace next to the bankers' tables, where many of you have heard me, and also in other places, please don't be surprised or create an uproar on that account. For the fact is that this is the first time I've appeared before a law court, although I'm 70 years old. So the language of this place is totally foreign to me. Now, if I were really a foreigner, you'd certainly forgive me if I spoke in the accents and the manner in which I've been raised. So now, too, I'm asking you, justly it seems to me, to overlook the manner of speaking. Maybe it will be less good, maybe it will be better. But consider and apply your mind to this alone, whether I say what's just or not, for that's the virtue or excellence of a juror, just as the orator's lies in telling the truth. That's a wonderful paragraph, especially the way it ends. Orator's lies in telling the truth, in terms of, that's a little clever pun, because I don't know if that's accurate to the Greek, but in English it certainly reads as, the job of an orator, like I was talking about a Dmitry Peskov in a few pods ago. Their job is to lie, but the orator's job is to tell the truth, as Socrates points out. So to go through this paragraph, though, so on the one hand, you can sort of look at this and you can see that Socrates is trying to get out ahead of certain things. He positively entreats of people. So he's trying to insist on speaking using the same language that he uses in the marketplace next to the banker's table. So why Socrates would be hanging out there, who knows why he was in the banker's table, but the marketplace being the place where he hung out, that's not completely crazy, because obviously there'd be a lot of people in the marketplace, etc., where many of you have heard of me, obviously. So but the interesting thing is just that Socrates has to go out of his way at the beginning, say, don't be surprised, don't create an uproar on that account, essentially, of the language I use. And it's kind of like, what could be so outrageous that he's going to provoke these sort of reactions? But as we roll through the dialogue, we will see that he is certainly going to provoke these reactions at least a few times, and it's written like a play where he's sort of rolls with the sort of yelling in from the crowd. And to once again sort of set the scene, Socrates he's before the court. And so he is sitting in front of a 500-person jury. And why Athenian juries were so big, I'm not sure, but the juries were quite big, and then they would vote on these matters, and it would be, I believe, one person, one vote. And obviously, as you can sort of see at the beginning of the first paragraph and this paragraph, etc., there was sort of a profession to be made, and this is arguably where the sophists got a lot of their work and were the most quote-unquote useful to people, was teaching them how to make speeches in court that would persuade people on whatever topic it was. And that's what a lot of these people actually specialized in, was making these sort of lawyerly speeches on behalf of other people, and or teaching other people how to make those speeches. And so you've got Socrates feeling like he is a bit out of his depth, because this is the first time him appearing before a law court. And there's an important distinction to be made between appearing before the court and participating in the court process, because within his society, and I think I said this once in the Euthyphro thing, but just to go over this again, you heard Euthyphro talk about what deme Miletus is from. The different tribes would be on a rotating basis, and within the tribe there would be lotteries to pick who would serve on juries. So that was a part of the democratic process in Athens, part of their democratic political state, and so their constitution, in other words. And so for Socrates to say that he's not familiar with the customs of court, what that makes you think is basically Socrates has never been in trouble before. Now, that doesn't mean that Socrates has never participated in the courts, however, because it's well known that Socrates did participate in the courts when he presided over the trial of the Athenian admirals who basically left some of their sailors in the water and got prosecuted for that, and they were all prosecuted within a single day, and et cetera, and I believe it's actually within this dialogue actually that Socrates goes through this history, so probably not going to get to that in this pod. I may actually stop this pod after this first page, because I really think going through a slow read of these dialogues, and they get longer as you roll through the dialogues, but to go through them slowly is really the best way to dig through the material. But just to put it in perspective, no, he's not completely familiar. He's not a Euthyphro who's utilizing the court system for personal vendetta reasons or whatever. He's unfamiliar with what it is to prosecute somebody, what it is to defend himself, but he's not completely unfamiliar with the process. And this is part of the false modesty thing, where Socrates will plead his ignorance, but anybody who knows that Socrates is far more sophisticated than he'll ever give himself credit for. And so so I guess another thing is, it's interesting just that Socrates, he tells them basically, try to overlook my style and just look at the substance, whether what I say is just or not. That's the virtue excellence of a juror. And so want to see if I should go on to the next paragraph, because guess we can do this next paragraph here, because no, you know what? I'm going to pause, because if I do this next paragraph, I'm not going to be going a page at a time, and we're going to go roughly in 1 to 2 page pace for these podcasts going forward, just to make them more bite-sized when I'm having to export them. So that's it for this time. Thanks.